one of the most important characteristics, in my opinion, with a great salesperson is being curious. It's someone who can ask a question, who can ask the next question that's connected to that first question, really listen to the first answer, not just for the answer you want to hear, but the answer you maybe don't want to hear.
Laurie, I am so excited for this. I heard so many great things from many past guests, especially the wonderful Rich. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Now, I always love to start with some context. So tell me, how did you make your way into the world of sales and come to lead some of the most incredible sales orgs as you have done?
Oh, thank you. Great questions. I discovered sales at the ripe age of 15 and a half, which was the day I got a worker's permit and could get a job. So I was fired up to get a job and make some money. I applied for a few retail jobs in my hometown, and the owner of two kind of neighboring boutiques met me and said, "You're hired. Start tomorrow." So excited. So I march in on my first day ready to get working. And he said, "Here are the keys to the other store. Go open it up. There's a shoebox of cash in the back. Use that for the cash register. I'll show up in a few hours and teach you what to do." And I was terrified. So he's like, "Open the store and get going." So I like, all right, I'm going to do this. I go and open the store. And soon after opening the door, customers started coming in. So I had to start selling. I did a terrible job. I don't think I charged sales tax to anyone that day. I'm sure there were some very good deals made, but what I got from it was the energy of working with customers, like how fun that is, how energizing that is. It's a thrill of partnering with someone, even in the retail capacity in a small boutique. So I got energized by it. And I stayed in retail throughout high school and college. And then fast forward, I graduated from college during the recession in the early 90s. So not a lot of jobs. I was still working in retail. And I was at a barbecue and talking to my oldest sister's friend who had been in the workforce for a number of years ahead of me. And she said, "Hey, Laurie, I work at a software company. We're doing kind of this group call interview for salespeople. Are you interested?" And I was like, both hands up. Let me get a job with a career path. Sounds good. I knew nothing about the company. I didn't know what they sold. I didn't know how they did it. I didn't know anything about the market. I just really wanted to just get in and get a kind of a firm job. So I went to the interview. I got the job, and that company was Remedy Corporation, which was later, became part of BMC. I think their software is still askew at BMC, which is amazing. And was really, like Harry, so fortunate. It was a formative part of my career, not just because it was my first, but I met mentors and friends that I still talk to just as recently as this week from that company, and was super fortunate to experience an IPO with them. So just saw like what high growth was all about from the start. So that was my story. That's how I got here.
So two things that I just have to dig in. One is like the takeaways from the organizations you've worked at. But just the first thing I'm too fascinated by, you mentioned your instant love of sales. Do you think sales is something that you instantly fall in love with? Or do you think it's something that you can learn to love over time? Which one do you think is more common amongst the best you've worked with?
Honestly, I think it's the latter. And I say that even though that wasn't my experience, because I think there's a perception sometimes about sales that it is just this like kind of robotic, anyone can do it, go and run a script, go. And there's not a lot of humanity to it. And I think when you really learn that there's an art and a science to it, that it's about genuine connection with people, that it's about really like listening and active listening, then I think you can really learn to love it. And I say that because of folks I've seen that I've been super fortunate to partner with and coach and mentor come along the way. So it's folks that really I've seen them kind of, them just blossom into sales when they maybe didn't think they could. They maybe didn't start as an SDR, or they just wanted to get a job just like me, but they see it and they see the opportunity. I think it's actually more the latter, even though my experience was that instant energy.
I absolutely love the honesty there also, Laurie. I was expecting you to be like, yeah, the first one, because that's what I just said. Okay. Now, my next question was like, we'd normally do a quick fire round at the end, but you've worked at some of the most incredible companies. I was like, well, how do I kind of compress this in a way where we get the takeaways in an efficient style? And so we're going to go through each company, and you're going to tell me a takeaway that's really impacted your mindset. And so if we start with Google, what was the takeaway and how did it impact how you think?
The real takeaway there is the importance of building like genuine connections to do great work. You can't do anything on your own at Google. It is so big. It's so complex. There's so many layers and crossover of teams and initiatives and budgets and structures that you have to learn quickly that the stakeholder partnerships you make are critical to how you get work done. And so from the start, you've got to get out there and not just stay in your lane. You've got to go learn about the neighboring businesses. You've got to learn about the partnerships that are going to help your business grow and learn about what are their motivations. It's not just about me. I was in Google Cloud. What's happening outside of Google Cloud? What's parallel to us? How can we work together? And if you do that in a genuine way, you can just, there's so much that you can, take that to. That's an applicable, skill and talent that carries over into any role. So that would be my takeaway from Google.
God, I'd be terrible there. I'm probably the worst team player in the world. The job interviewer is like, are you a team player? No, not at all.
You can learn it. You can learn it.
You can. Okay, next one is Facebook. What was the takeaway from there?
Facebook was, I would say, focus on impact. Facebook is well, a big company when I was there, even, bigger company from a numbers perspective, but they do a lot of work in really small teams and focus on just the impact you can make. So narrow your list down to the 3 things that are going to make the biggest impact and carry that forward versus getting kind of diluted across a long list of to-do. And you see that the way the company operates.
Next one, Navan or trip actions. What were the takeaways there?
2 would be really comfortable with moving fast and being really comfortable with ambiguity. We did not have all the answers, but we were moving fast and we were figuring it out as we went. And not just like being comfortable with it, but finding energy in it, like getting excited that you don't know what's next. So what do you craft, to build a plan that could go in a few different directions and that can morph and change? So that kind of flexibility, but definitely learned the speed and the ambiguity there.
I love that response. We're going to get into also like flexibility and gaining energy from ambiguity. But the final one I do have to ask is Box. What was the takeaways for Box?
That was probably a favorite place of mine. And I would say from Box, lots of learnings, but I would say the one big learning that has been kind of core to the way they've run the company from the start is to be an owner. So really believe that we collectively are the company. It isn't someone else. It isn't above you, below you, from the sides. It's from the way you put your attention into an email you're sending a prospect to the way you're navigating big operational organizational change management. You are it. You're part of it. You're doing it with a team. It's not happening to you. You're help getting it done. And that's really something Aaron just has built and made core to the culture. And I've carried it forward in every place I've been since.
Is that why it was your favorite?
It's one of the reasons, definitely. You really felt that you were part of something at Box you were part of the build. And that meant for the goods and the bads, right? It's not just the highs, that everyone was in for all of it. And you really felt it. You felt it from, the executive leadership team, the founders, of course, and then just down into we were hiring a ton of people, and you could get that energy inspired across a team of SDRs or sales rep coming in. Like the energy that creates it's palpable.
I loved having Aaron on the show. Very, very special person. Now, I want to dive into some of the weeds.
Sure.
We often hear the term sales playbook. Mm-hmm. Before we get into whether the founder should be the one to do it or whether someone else should do it, how do you define sales playbook?
That's a good question. I think it's, a playbook should be think of it as more of a GPS. So it doesn't have to be a script, like each step down to the minute detail. Think of it as a guide. So depending on where you are in a sales process, whether it's very early and you're doing discovery and trying to get or even earlier trying to get a meeting, and then down to doing discovery and carrying it all the way through, I think a playbook is like, what's the successful motion in this stage of the cycle that you should go lean into and flex your strength or get the support around in order to have a successful outcome. So I think it's all about thinking of it as drawing on the experience and the success you've seen from previous sales engagements and building that into a guide that can help you navigate through, but enough that still gives that level of creativity and flexibility that accounts for the style of that salesperson, depending on whether they're early, whether they're a leader, whether they're a direct, individual contributor.
You said that building on the success of prior sales interactions and engagements. Does that mean that the head of sales should be the one to create it, or should founders create it and then pass it off?
Yeah, good question. I think the founders are the right folks to create it for a few reasons. I mean, there's where it started, right? They had the passion, they had the idea. No one has more passion than them. No one can better articulate the story. So they start from that place of like, this is my belief, this is my idea, this is my baby. So that there's that you're found grounding from. And what that creates is the person that knows the why and the what in such a deep level that they can anticipate things like, what problem are we trying to solve? And then when they get that customer feedback, pivoting. So like, is that really as important a problem as I thought it would be for the customer? And if it is or it isn't, how do we change our playbook to amplify how our solution solves that problem? So I think that them being the closest to it allows them to pivot just not only the playbook, but also like feedback back to product. So for example, at WorkRamp, Ted is a go-to-market leader and also has an incredible product background. So what's great about that is him setting the playbook, which he did here, is he knows how customers respond. He knows what really matters to them and how our story fits in. And then if we get some feedback, even now where he's less, connected, less as close to the playbook as he was in the early days, he still knows like, hey, Ted, here's what we're hearing. We need to adjust this. He'll take that feedback. So I think it's great formatively in the beginning, but then it can carry through as your company grows as well.
I also think you cannot hire a head of sales unless you know what sort of playbook you're running.
Exactly. Like, how do you coach them? And how do you guide them? Exactly.
And also, there's so many different types of heads of sales.
Yeah.
Some are much more enterprise heavy. Some are much more PLG.
Exactly. Exactly.
Totally. Okay. So when we think about that first kind of hire, so to speak, most often go for the logoed rep or the logoed person. But you feel differently. Why do you believe this approach of like the hailed logo person isn't maybe the right one?
A couple reasons. I believe, especially in the early stages, that there's a huge opportunity to not only like identify and sprout new talent in a startup, because you're looking for someone who's demonstrated drive and ambition and all that good stuff. But that doesn't just translate into a huge logo person. It's like, what gets them energized? How do they navigate through ambiguity? They don't come in with this is the only way to do things. There's an openness to like, I am in it because I'm passionate and I believe in this. And I have all the talent to go navigate challenges and to go build something, but I'm not so set in a way that there's only one way to do it. So I think there's a great benefit you get from not just like creating that environment where you're going to create some great leaders that are going to go grow into other, amazing things and help that company or future companies grow. But there's a mindset that there's a grit and a scrappiness that can help you really accelerate through that energy of that team. So I'm a big believer in you can really do great things with maybe a more junior perceived junior talent because of the creativity they can bring, and they don't have kind of a bias from a previous experience.
Can I ask you, does this change if we're doing an enterprise motion versus a PLG motion?
Certainly. I think a PLG motion, lends itself to that scale up, right? So you can have volume, you can have velocity, you can have a lot of tries, right? Which is good for just testing messaging. It's good for just trying different sales plays. So I think it's easier, to your point, to do that with a, PLG stepping into SMB and mid-market and beyond versus top down. So I would just say on the enterprise side, it's more, there's probably a lot of nuance to what market you're entering. If you're going into security, you probably want some folks with that, gravitas that can go speak to a CISO and go, have those conversations. But I think there's still an element to it. You can still find some up and comers that could play there as long as they've got a good surrounding support, team around them to help them be successful.
So, Laurie, I'm with you in terms of the scrappiness, the hunger of those early reps. The hard question is when.
Yeah.
Some founders just hate it selling, and so they want it as soon as possible. Yeah. Some wait far too long.
Yeah.
How do you advise founders on when's the right time to add that scrappy, hungry profile?
I think it's all about thinking about scale. So if the founder's doing it, and let's say you've got 10 to 20 customers, like how much more can they do? Like just in their straight daily capacity, how much can they get done in addition to growing and scaling the company through all the other disciplines, through engineering, through product, through all the other things that kind of overseeing just the operations of the business. So I think it's that moment where you find you've got enough customers and you find enough of a repeatable process that can take your good work and grow it, and take and get and have feedback. I think also just someone that you can work with, like, hey, we've been trying this for the first X number of customers. Let's try something. Let's tune that a little bit. I'll go try that and come back to you with feedback. You try, there's someone you can play with, which I think there's huge value in having partnership, the kind of how many people do you hire at a certain time? There's huge value in being to learn from someone that's next to you. So I think it's a combination of customers, how many you have, and just thinking about the CEO or founder needs to now scale beyond and focus on other things. And this person can help them do that, but they can still stay close.
I was going to ask exactly that, which is like Jason Lemkin says about hiring the 2x2, Hunger Games, fight till death and, kill the other one who doesn't, get $1 million in ARR. My point, but he doesn't actually say that. That's really unfair of me.
It's all good. It's all good.
But my point is, should we hire more than one at a time? Or does that actually impact quality of onboarding and the challenge of ramping them?
Yeah, no, good question. I do. I think you should hire more than one at a time for a few reasons. Less about the competition. I think that's kind of going to happen maybe naturally, but it's more about you can work for scale. I think if you're onboarding one person, it's onboard as many as you can, because just that time and investment in onboarding, is a big commitment. So if you're onboarding one, there's huge value in onboarding more. I think there's goodness in creating a team and having a place for those first sellers to collaborate and say, hey, I'm going to try this message, this motion, this sales play. Maybe let's tune it a bit. You try this, we can test and see what's working. And then you just, you created that first kind of group founding team. There's nothing like it. There's learnings, there's energy, there's culture that comes from that. So there's just so much positive byproduct from building a team through having, a small group that starts. Just back to my own experience, I'm still connected to that first team that founded back at Remedy. Those first sellers are still people I talk to, and they have such a bond. So I think there's this common, we're going to go do this together that you get that carries through and just reverberates through the company culture and is very foundational.
I'm totally with you, especially on the efficiency of batching onboarding. I find it a nightmare. And so when you can do more than one at once, take it. I want to run a hypothetical process with you where you're a advisor or angel in my company and I am a founder scaling the sales team. We've now identified that I need this scrappy hustler mentality and profile.
Yeah.
How do I literally structure the process for hiring a new sales team member?
So I think from a process perspective is you break down an interview process into kind of chunks, if you will. So the first part would be just vetting for, and this is a term I learned at Google, which the way just they framed it is really helpful, is vetting for just role related knowledge. Do they have knowledge that relates to the role that you feel would say, yes, I want them to kind of go through to the next phase in the process? So do they demonstrate the characteristics? Do they know enough to be dangerous, right? And some experience that they can lean on to go forward from a role with the company. And then the next scale in the process is the how. So how have they been successful? What stories can they lean on and tell you how they've navigated through a win or a loss? Most importantly, a loss. How did they bring in different resources? How do they navigate change? Because, a lot of folks will say, oh yes, I want to be part of a startup. I'm ready for it. I'm ready for all the crazy and the chaos, but are they really? Do they really want that? So really kind of peel back those layers and ask questions that can help you reveal how they've navigated something really hard. And does that energize them, or does that make them go, run away? So
what questions do you ask? Because salespeople sell a good game.
Oh, they do. Yeah. No, I think it's no, you're absolutely right. Because, there's some great people can interview really well and tricky, right? So I think the things to dig in on is I like to ask about a loss. And so, and less about tell me why you lost, but it's what did they do? So, it wasn't, they're not pointing to someone else. They're not saying, it was this person's fault. It was my territory. It was this, there's something else other than me, but it was what resources did you bring in to help you? What did you learn from that? Give me an example of what you learned from that loss and how you brought it to your next win. And what that demonstrates is not only an ability to kind of reflect and take an experience, learn from it and turn it into action, but also how do they work in a team? Because I think especially in a startup, the team is so critical to the success. And so how do they partner with other resources in the company to go get something done? So I think vetting for that is really important. And then I think, if you hear too many mentions of I mean, of course it's sales and you want folks to be proud of their performance. But if it's too much on just what they did independently, for me, that's a red flag, because I think no one wins, independently. It's a team sport.
Totally with you. I also think data is just so important. Like the
Absolutely.
more fluff I get, I love it when you see like I increased net revenue retention by 12% through these 3 channels. And
exactly.
So I'm like, right.
Yeah, specificity. It's great. And it also demonstrates that they're proud of that, right? So it's like they're sharing that data with you because they're proud of what they did to get there. So there's just 2 really like interesting parts of that answer.
Okay, so we have phase 1, which is like role knowledge fit. Phase 2, which is kind of like data and supporting evidence to suggest quality. What next?
So I think, if you're going to go through the steps of having them maybe present to your team or do some sort of, mock discovery, mock sales call, whatever kind of the, case study work that you do. I think that's an important step in the exercise. I don't think it is incumbent that it has to be on their current solution or it has to be on yours. I've seen it done both ways. I like putting in front of the candidate about the company they're going to come join, not because I'm looking for the perfect answer, but more I like that they just go and do homework. Like are they curious? It demonstrates if they're, which to me is like a critical characteristic of a great salesperson is curiosity. What they go learn about us? What did they find that was interesting? They might find something in our story that we aren't leaning into as much that we should amplify more. So I like to have some sort of case study, discovery call, whatever it might be, that's on the company that they're representing. And so that they can come and kind of tell how they interpret that. And then also how they, that's not an easy situation to be in also. So it's kind of high stakes. So how do they operate in that? Like, are they comfortable being uncomfortable? Because that's what a lot of sales is. So look for signals like that too.
I'm with you totally on the doing it on your company. It's not that popular an answer, but I like it way more. My favorite is when it's like, do it on a company that we know nothing about either.
Right.
It's like, well, how?
They could say anything, right? We wouldn't know. Like, what are you even vetting for at that point? Exactly.
Ridiculous suggestion.
I'm with you.
In terms of the next step, they've blown us away. They're fantastic and we want to offer it to them. What are some of your biggest lessons on compensation and title when it comes to sales team additions?
So on compensation, I think you learn a lot in that moment with the candidate. So you learn a lot about them. And especially if it's competitive and they might come to you and say, hey, I'm getting, $50K more OTE over here. And then you ask, okay, well, what does that mean for you? What does that represent? Is it in equity? Is it in OTE? What is it? And what's driving that ask? So I think with compensation, it's an opportunity to really understand what motivates that person. And also if they have it's a startup, do they really believe they're taking a risk? Are they excited about that future opportunity that shows up in equity? What are their questions around equity? You see an excitement in those questions? And if it comes down to just dollars on OTE, I'm always a little bit it's not a full red flag depending on, where the conversation goes, but it's something that concerns me because that will come back, in the future where someone's going to be, maybe, you have a hard quarter. How do they navigate that? If things don't come together, do they have the staying power to work through, the ups and downs that can happen in a startup? So I think it's a moment to really understand what someone's motivations are, and also just see kind of where their research went. How deeply do they care about the opportunity in front of them? Is it just a OTE, or is it they really care about the mission of the company and they want to be a part of building? How
do you think about whether to pay up for someone versus say, you go for the other role? I've done that. I've said, when someone's really like, this OTE is so I can't step away from this, and maybe you could get closer and bridge it enough. But if that is all they're talking about, sometimes you have to walk away and say, you know what, that sounds like it's a better fit for you. And if that changes, let's, I always leave a door open. I think it's important. The valley's small, right? You just cannot, shut a door. And so I think it's okay to leave it open, but it's okay to sometimes walk away. I'm trying to think if there's anyone that we walk away from that I was like, that got away. And no one's coming to mind. So, that tells me that those weren't the wrong decisions. Do you have any lessons on title and what people want in title that's important?
It's honestly like a discovery call in sales. It's like, what's the why behind the title? Are they looking because they want to demonstrate a certain level of progression on their LinkedIn profile? Is it that they want to demonstrate scope? Is it someone who's maybe, and I've seen this like gotten stuck with title at a big company where it, the titles get a little murkier and are a little more flat, and they come out and they're like, I need to break out of this, kind of big company title level conundrum that I'm trapped in, and I want something to demonstrate my scope. So I think it's a very individual conversation, but I also think it's important to keep in mind, and this is hard to do, what you're setting up for will impact the future. So if you get too aggressive on title, then you're a couple years down the road and your next person comes in and they're like, well, wait, why am I not a senior director? Maybe that first person wasn't, and so you're like, okay, now we got to unwind this a little bit. So I think it's okay to be comfortable with some of that in the beginning, but I think you just have to be aware of like, all right, this might be something that we have to navigate or walk back a bit as we grow.
The one that I've learned is the external accreditation that can be needed. And when they say, hey, as you said to the why, hey, my chances of selling more are increased with a inflated title because I have so much more. I'm like, I get that.
Completely. Exactly. You're using it to go accelerate growth. That's a good answer, right? So yeah, 100%. Yeah.
No. Not doing that. Are there any other red flags in the interview process where you're like, oof, you should get the heebie-jeebies if you hear this?
I think, again, it's like if there's, to your point, people can interview well if the answers just are shallow. If they're just very canned and shallow and you feel like, okay, anyway, I could play back, a bunch of different LinkedIn posts and collect a bunch of these and this would be an answer. If they can't connect to an actual customer engagement. Like I like it when someone's like, to your point, the stats that are really showing you like passion behind the work they did, and then a real like customer story and team story. If there aren't enough of those, like there's not enough depth. And that, that means you might get some performance for a while, but that's going to fizzle out.
We are going to move to your biggest strength, which apparently is the kind of onboarding and trust building process. But I do just have to ask, before that, when we reflect on the hiring process and your hires that you've made, what are the biggest hiring mistakes that you've made and how's that shaped your mindset?
I think, transparently, if I didn't vet some of those things as deeply as I just walked through. So I've had folks that it came off in an interview were super ambitious, right? They're like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to build this. And they had this energy about them. But when you really peeled back how they're going to do it, not vetting the how enough. I've had that happen in the past where it's like, it looked really good, but we didn't go deep enough on that how. I'm not, I don't think you need to do.
What do you mean the how? Like the ways in which they achieved were murky, like it was non-ethical?
Yeah, exactly. And then I think another piece is, I don't think you need to do a million references because people are going to send you the references, of course, that are going to say all the good things. But I do think if you can get some connection to people that have worked alongside with some sort of, reference backdoor that shares a little bit more insight is helpful. And I think in places where we're maybe moving too fast because we really had to get it done and couldn't get some of that, those additional touch points that we could have maybe seen around a corner in advance. And I think, again, it's a lot of it is folks want to say they're ready for a startup, and like, I'm all about it. It's going to be great. I'm in for the journey. And then they get there and they're like, wait, what? So I think I've made some mistakes there. It's hard to vet, honestly, because it's hard to say like, you can anticipate everything and prepare someone for that. But there's been some places where it's like, this is just too fast and too ambiguous and too crazy. And I can't, but that's, I think you should expect one of those every once in a while, right? Because it's just
the most common I see with young founders is actually an insecurity in themselves of their lack of experience, which leads to what you said earlier, which was the logo hire. They look for the Salesforce logo because they're aware that they don't have that experience.
Right. 100%. I 100% agree with you. And it's not about that.
Okay, so now we've got this brilliant talent. We've got this team on board. Great. We're going to go to the process of onboarding and working with them. And you said to me before that selling requires active listening and genuine human connection. I read it, felt warm and fuzzy, and respectfully didn't have a clue what it meant.
No problem.
What specifically and tangibly can be done to create this active listening and genuine human connection?
Good question. So one of the most important characteristics, in my opinion, with a great salesperson is being curious. You have to be curious about not just what you bring to market and excited by that, but what the other person's company, role, career path goals are. Let's, for the sake of the exercise, say we've hired someone that is curious, that really cares and is interested in that person on the other end of the Zoom call, right? That they're meeting with and they're selling to. What active listening means is, if you walk that back to a core sales skill, it's discovery. So just walking back to like a core, common language that we all know in sales, it's discovery. It's someone who can ask a question, who can ask the next question that's connected to that first question, really listen to the first answer to inform the next question. And listen, not just for the answer you want to hear, but the answer you maybe don't want to hear, which is, some red flag roadblock that's going to slow down or make the selling engagement difficult. It's listening for the places where there's alignment, and it's listening for the places where there isn't alignment, that we need to go build that alignment through a really tight sales engagement. The way you teach that, I think, there's a lot of, just discovery, I think, is important. You don't naturally are like, oh, I'm great at asking questions. Like, I think you have to shadow a lot and listen a lot, and it's a practice art. But so you have to prioritize that as a sales team and make sure that those questions are happening. So you have to enable around it, and then you have to listen for it. So for example, with my current team, we do a lot of re-listening of calls. Like we publicly in a Slack channel mark them when they're perfect. And we say, this is a perfect call, and we want to highlight why this is perfect. Now, perfect doesn't mean you get every single piece right, but it means that you were really demonstrating the active listening. So we demonstrate with our leadership that this is important and matters. And we're going to teach you how to do it by giving you an example of one of your peers who does it great. So that's how that turns into action beyond the warm and fuzzy.
What tool do you use for your listening?
Gong.
Got you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have that, and we mark it as a perfect call. Mm-hmm. Can I ask, what makes an imperfect call on the flip side? If that's what we should look for, where is it like, this is not a good call?
This is bad. I think when a salesperson is just going through a script, and they're just going through, there's maybe we inform them through enablement, here's some great questions that can help guide a call. And instead of asking them and pausing and listening about where that question takes they just go to the next question. So it's more of just like a checkbox. And that perception, it goes back to that perception sometimes with sales of being just a, kind of robotic method. It's like, no, there's a list, and we might give you that to help guide you, but that is not meant to be just something you kind of check. Because then you're wasting the customer's time, and you're wasting your own time because you didn't get anything from that experience.
How do you think about effective goal setting for SDRs? Because I find discovery can be manipulated to align to the output desired for the goal. And so what I mean by that, if it's approved leads, discovery can be leaning towards approving it more so than not.
Yeah. How
do you create goals that actually align to outcomes versus ticking the box?
Yeah, no, then I've seen that, definitely have had that happen. So that is I think anyone who's led any sort of sales development team, or the team right after the sales development team, has experienced that. And I think the way to mitigate that is a few ways, is having, a qualification criteria that has to be met. So if it's a BANT, if it's whatever the structure is that identifies kind of the core drivers of that call. But also, I think what can validate if that's quality is to have some sort of checkpoint, if you will, of sales stage progression. So let's say you set a meeting, an opportunity, it's early in stage, but we're going to incentivize when that opportunity goes to the next stage. So when the seller takes over, but they move it forward, because that is a vote of quality, right? That demonstrates that opportunity that you created for that salesperson moved forward in their funnel. And I think that's a moment of yes, we had stage progression off this. This wasn't just to your point, like a fluffy meeting that didn't went anywhere, that checked a box, that got the list on the dashboard, all that good stuff. It actually is turning into something. So I think that's another way to just counterbalance and mitigate that. But I think you have to have some sort of structure. So, I've used BANT in the past, I've used Anim in the past. There's all sorts of different ones you can use, but something that says this person is giving a signal that they want to continue the conversation with us. And there's a time frame, and there's a budget, and they have some understanding of the buying process.
So I've got so many questions. One, what are the biggest signs that a sales rep is not working? When are me and you going to sit down and go, oh, no?
I think it's activity. I mean, you have to put in the activity. If you're not having enough conversations and you're not working to accelerate the pipeline you have or create the pipeline that you need to have, then what are you doing? So I think you have to go back to pipeline acquisition and pipeline acceleration. What are you doing on both? Most of the time it's going to be on acceleration, right? Because the intention is they're not creating all of their own pipeline. But I do think it's very important for sellers to create some of their own pipeline. They're not fully responsible for it, but they have to have skin in the game on creating pipeline. So I look at those two metrics. It's acceleration and acquisition, and then also how are they, taking feedback? So let's say they have an opportunity that doesn't progress. Let's dissect that. Like, let's do some, post-mortem and then learn in the next one. If you're not seeing that learning pick up, after giving the right coaching and resourcing, then that's a sign to have a conversation.
The reason the show's successful is because I ruthlessly use guests just for their advice on my own life. I sit on quite a few boards and they often say, the deal was about to convert, but then they pushed it to next quarter. And I'm always like, how do I respond to that? Legitimately, there could be reasons, and then otherwise it could just not be legitimate reasons. Yeah. How do you respond to the statement, it got pushed to next quarter?
So the first question would be, did you have mutual agreement with the prospect on when we would execute? So did you work on a mutual evaluation plan or some sort of joint evaluation plan that had milestones that said this is the time frame that we both agree to? If the answer is yes, and the circumstance that pushed it is something like, and we've seen this in 2023 and the end of 2022, if there's some internal event, let's say there's a riff, like, hey, we were going down this process, we were all in with you, but we just had a reduction in force. We have to pause, we have to reassess, but this is still a priority. Then that's, it's hard to anticipate that, right? Like an external person can't anticipate that. But if it's like, I was told this was the timing. My person agreed. Okay, maybe you never had access to the economic buyer. You really were just working with a champion that didn't have the power to really understand the buying process. So a lot of the core of that, like if it's a result of the salesperson's engagement, it's because there wasn't access to the economic buyer. That's usually like the number one part of MEDDIC that makes it fail is you're not there.
How do you know whether you're actually speaking to the economic buyer? A lot of people internally like to pump their chest and I can do this, I can do this.
Yeah. Well, I think you start from doing the discovery with your champion and coach to understand, like, who are the stakeholders? Like, who ultimately signs? Like, who actually docu-signs this? Whose budget does it come from? And how does this fit into their priorities? That's super important because, especially right now, when a lot of companies are looking at saving, and cost cutting and where can they consolidate? If you haven't sold to the economic buyer that really understands the true value of what you're bringing, it's very likely that you can be consolidated, away from. But if you have built value and connection with that economic buyer and they understand how that's solving a problem for them, you're mitigating that chance of being consolidated against. So I think it's really understanding, like, who's the ultimate person where this impacts. And if they are looking at their P&L and this is part of it, or they, thumbs up, I'm not changing.
Having a single champion is dangerous. They can leave. You need to multi-thread. How do you multi-thread without making someone feel quite commoditized of like, oh, I get it. They want to speak to
You're trying to build your stakeholder map. Right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. How do you do that?
Because in fact, it's so funny. I was just having this conversation this week. If you've got a great champion, it's like, there's such opportunity with that. And letting them know that, like, if we partner to share this story on what we're doing together inside your organization, that can, like, how can that make their experience and life and goals and career path and exposure, whatever it might be that they're looking for, get amplified, right? So first you got to get the buy-in with the champion instead of like going around and trying to meet a bunch of people, going on LinkedIn to figure out who else in this company do I know. It's like, first get the buy-in from the champion of why. Like, it's so important in every sales engagement. Explain the why, explain why you're doing it, and then get some of their buy-in. Could you refer me to, like, for example, is there another department that we might partner that might be using our solution? How would they interact with it? Could I get a conversation with them just to better understand their goals? And also always say, I'm not going to take an hour of their time. Make sure you're also setting the stage that you're going to be respectful, that they have a job to do and other priorities that don't include you. So making sure you bring that humanity to the conversation is super important. But I think it's like not doing it it's back to that checklist question, is like not doing it just to check the thing, to really understand curiously, like, how will my solution stretch across an organization and how to meet the people that are going to be part of that.
Laurie, is old school enterprise selling dead in the way that you take them to the Super Bowl, you take them to Beyonce, Taylor Swift, the old school, like,
that stuff.
Sporting. Is that dead or is that alive, actually?
I don't think it's fully dead. I mean, it was the play when I started. Like that was it. You flew out to Texas, you took them to the steakhouse, you did all that stuff, right? I think with COVID and realizing what we can do remote, that has absolutely changed the game with how much selling you can do virtually. And I think if you do that right and it doesn't feel transactional, you can still have a very genuine connection with a buyer. I think it hasn't died, but I think it's just been kind of relegated to like a very specific motion that's happening. And it's almost additive, if that makes sense. It's like you've got to still do all the work to have that moment really have strong ROI. But still, inherently people like getting together and connecting and building that. So I think there's a lot of goodness to that. It's just like, how do you use that moment and what's the return for the customer and for the company?
I think it's also like know your buyer. And it sounds awful, but like the older school company. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they might be like, you know what? I don't want to hang out with you after work. Yeah. I'd rather hang out with my family and friends. So no, thank you, but I appreciate the offer, right?
No, I totally get you. Can I ask, do you ever do discounting? It's often the lever to get deals over the line. How do you think about discounting and how do you advise founders on whether to or not to do it?
I mean, there's some dependence on, what market you're in, how many competitors, all that good stuff. Like if it's a really competitive market and there's not as much differentiation as you'd like, you might need to do it to just get a foothold and to make sure you are grabbing market share where you can. I, definitely understand when that has to happen. I think it's all about a trade-off. It's like, what are you demonstrating from a value trade for that? Is there something that, hey, I'm going to give you this discount, but in exchange for that, especially in the early stages, I need references. I need folks that will speak on our behalf beyond just me, said founder or sales leader or whomever the person is in the engagement. So I think you should just make sure you're preserving value through what that trade-off is with the discount. And I think in the early days, it's like customer stories, it's references, it's introductions to, hey, are there referrals you can help me with that can help me broaden my reach that I maybe couldn't get myself? And then also just, of course, you want to not make sure you're demonstrating what that discount represents. So I think it's also, I'm a big fan of like when you're even going to proposal stage, showing it like this is exactly what's coming off of this original list price. This is what that means. So you really see it visually. And that sits with the buyers. They recognize that the collection of your good work to get to this stage has produced this discount. We're going to support it, provided we're going to execute on the timeframe that we agreed to mutually.
How do you think about multi-year deals and paid upfront? What's your advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, multi-year deals right now especially are a good thing, right? Because you're, like gross retention, right? And so they're a good thing. I think, again, you can put some financial incentive behind it and make them very compelling for the customer and for, the vendor. So I think it's a good thing to do. I think, and there's ways to also incent a sales team to do it well. So you're not, you're thinking about like, hey, if you get a multi-year deal, this is some things we can do from a future pricing perspective or things like that.
I thought it was interesting. I had Mark Goldberger on, who I think you maybe worked with.
Yeah, I worked with him. I worked with him at Navan, yeah.
Yeah, so when I spoke to him about testimonials, he said with all our customers, we basically have it baked in that they will give us customer testimonials, which is a bold statement.
That is bold, yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel about customer testimonials and what works in terms of getting them?
I think you have to, that's bold, but I think you have to, and I'm a big fan of Mark, but you have to say, there's a caveat around that. Like we've got to prove value. So we've got to prove what we've been telling you for whatever this selling motion period is. We're confident we're going to do that. And in exchange for that, we'd like a testimonial. But I think it's important to ask, but I think it's important to set the framework is like, we're going to meet the mutual goals that we agreed on. We're going to get you to what you're trying to reach from a, organization perspective. And then ask and say, and at that moment, I'm going to come back and ask for it. And I think it's a seeding opportunity. It also demonstrates that you're staying connected to them for the long term. I think when a customer really is in partnership with you and believes that you genuinely are looking for a long-term fruitful partnership, they're going to be apt to do that because they believe that genuine human connection that you've demonstrated and that great discovery and that great listening is going to prove to be a really good investment long-term. So I think if you set that stage, then you can get that testimonial, but you should, I think, make sure you're going back to, you're going to prove the value that you've said you would bring.
I love people. Okay, I'm all in for this genuine human connection shit that you've got going. I love it. I'm there. Okay, I know. Someone described me the other day as the Ricky Gervais of venture and startup. So I was like, don't know if that's a positive or not.
Do I like that? Do I not like that?
But I'm all in for this. But then my problem is, okay, we've got this beautiful, genuine, connection, human relationship. Speak to my CS team now because you're handed off. That handoff feels quite dehumanized. How do you think about retaining genuine human connection, care, relationship with a very efficient but dehumanized handoff?
Yeah, no, I think you can't make it dehumanized. And in my role today, I'm responsible for all of, from sales through to customer success through to support. And we operate as a revenue organization. So we don't operate as a sales organization and an implementation organization and a success organization and a support organization. It's one. And what we prioritize to make that not feel like a handoff is the conversation that happens. We are engaged in each part. So for example, if we're closing out our quarter and we're about to plan an implementation and the next phase of that customer's journey, that implementation manager's on that last call and they meet them and they say, this is my colleague. These are some of the customers that they've worked with. They're a rock star. They're going to carry you through. And I'm going to join when you go to launch that last call. So it's like, you've got to not hand the baton off and then let go. You've got to hand the baton off, but say, I'm coming back and I'm going to stay connected. And you can also do that with just like structure of how you compensate people with upsell and things like that. So to make sure there's an incentive, but I think you've got to show it. Like you actually have to show up to the call and stay engaged. And then additionally, let's say you're now with a customer, you've launched, you're with a customer success manager. I think the account executive needs to join those QBRs. They need to listen. They need to participate. They need to not be maybe the one driving the QBR that the customer success manager is leading, but they need to show up. And what that shows is like, I care about you as a customer. I'm not just, closing the deal, moving on, closing the deal, moving on. I'm staying with you through the life cycle of and seeing your success through.
What, for those that don't know, what's a QBR and how are the best structured?
There's argument to do quarterly or monthly, but essentially a regularly scheduled business review with your customer that demonstrates how they are progressing against the goals we originally set. So let's say that is, you're going to launch in our environment and WorkRamp, you're going to launch a certain number of classes, you're going to build a certain number of guides, you're going to hold this many whatever, certifications, whatever it might be. We're going to walk through, how'd you do? Like how did we agree on those, and how did we set you up to have that engagement, and how did the engagement go? What was the activity from it? How are your users engaged? So really use data, back to your data, like show them with data what is happening with their investment, and then show them opportunities. Like, here's some things that you aren't doing yet. And we have 5 customers that look just like you that are doing this really well. We want to share that. We think we should try it. Let's get a call on the calendar to talk through how we can do that. So it should be a moment where you're validating the goals of what were originally set, but also really bringing the value of what else can you do? Because it shouldn't just be a checkbox, right? Like, great, you purchased it, you got it, launch, go. What else is happening? How do you activate the roadmap? How do you activate what's coming in the future? Here's some insight into what we're building. We think this could help you reach your goals. So that's what that moment's all about. It can be, I think there's arguments for doing it more frequently, less frequently, but the importance is to have it, it's like at a regular schedule.
Have you ever had a QBR where you went, I wasn't proud handing off to that CS person? Like, they didn't do me justice.
Sure.
And what do you do then?
I think that when that happens, it's probably because you're just going too fast. It's like, it's one of those moments where you got to slow down to speed up, and you're doing back to the checkbox, exercise of like, here's what we did. We're going to kind of just read back versus actually like articulate and connect. And it usually is because you're just going too fast. So
do you think you can anticipate churn ahead of time?
Yeah, you've got to look for signals. And then some of it is subjective, of course, because anticipation is going to come from a customer success manager connecting with a customer and like reading that experience and figuring out what does that mean. But I think you can measure a customer's health throughout of, let's say a quarterly fiscal, whatever the time frame is. And that can be with data and usage, but it also can be like, hey, we set up these milestone calls. We're going to have these calls to make sure we're progressing. Let's say they miss the calls. Let's say they continue to put, like, back to your question, it keeps getting pushed. Why is it getting pushed? We're not on the priority. Take that information, marry it with the customer data. If both are down, that's a signal that you could be stepping into an area of risk. So I definitely think you can do, basically measure the health score of a customer, and using both data and anecdotal experience and seeing like, what does that tell us? And then how do we get ahead of it? Okay, so let's say they're not attending calls. Does a leader in the customer success or revenue organization need to step in and say, hey, I understand, these were your original goals. We're excited to really continue to work with you. We'd really like to get a call. We've understand there's been some challenges. Could we get that? So like go title match, go to their leader and try to get a call and kind of shake something loose. That oftentimes can do it, because sometimes it's just the person below who doesn't have the time, right? So they just need someone to kind of bump it up on their priority list. So a lot of times just intervening works, or going back to what was their original goal and bringing that up. Like we were set to achieve this. We see this as risk. We want to help you achieve it. So I think it's driving that activity and trying to get that connection back.
You said there about measuring health score. Final one, I could talk to you all day, but final one is actually deal reviews. Crucial part of what we do. How do you structure them? How often do you do them? Who sets the agenda? I've never done them before. I'm this angel investment of yours. What would you advise me?
I think what's important is a good deal review is based on a common framework. So whatever your framework might be, let's say it's MEDDIC, just for, the structure's sake, that the team participating in the deal review knows what you're going to be asking and can prepare. Not that it should be a big exercise and huge prep. You're not, writing a PhD dissertation to do a deal review, but, know what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the metrics that are important to that customer. We're going to talk about who the economic buyer is. We're going to talk about their process from a decision-making process and a decision-making, structure. So we're going to talk about those. So common language, really important. Second is you use the deal review to learn and diagnose. You're looking to see, are we on the right track? You're not looking to just tell someone they're doing a bad job like that. They're going to come in with a defense and tell you what you want to hear and make the deal review not as productive. Also, deal review should not be story time. I always say this. It's not your time to tell me a story. Don't say, oh, I met with this person who's connected to this person. I talked to this person. This is what we said. And they said this. I was like, no, I don't. That's fine that there's a story, but let's get back to that framework. Who's making a decision? Where are we in that process? What roadblocks and what resources do you need? The whole point of a deal review should be what resources and support is needed to go make this accelerate, and where are the gaps right now? So I think that makes a really good deal review.
What's a good reason to lose a deal versus a bad reason? Sometimes
I think a good reason is if there really is just a mismatch in what the customer needs from a feature perspective. And they're saying they want this, and you realize we're just not going to fit that for them. And we might in the beginning, but then it's going to create churn. So you got to anticipate, is this customer going to stay with us for long term? Are we really a match? So I think it's okay to sometimes say, we're just not going to meet their needs. They want this very specific use case. Yeah, we could put some resources behind it and make this happen, but are we going to do that on repeat? Probably not. So let's move on to a customer where there's a really good fit, like our real ICP. So I think that's an okay reason to lose. I think, and it's okay to you're going to lose some. So you also have to be comfortable with that. You're going to lose some competitively sometimes. So I think first getting comfortable with that and realizing how do you find those ones that are going to be really, solid wins?
Totally get you. What's a bad reason?
Bad reason loses you didn't anticipate the competition and how they were engaged, or how much the competition was positioning, what really the customer cared about, how the competition could answer that question and how we could answer that question. So it's back to discovery, really not understanding what the core goals were for the customer, and that a competitor could outsell you in that moment. And you didn't ask the deeper questions on what their top priorities were.
Final one, I promise. But this is all predicting pipeline and predicting how much we're going to make, bluntly. One of your friends said you're one of the best in the world, to quote, at predictable sales execution. How do you think about forecasting with accuracy when times are as challenging as they are in terms of volatility?
First, that's a really nice friend. So I don't know who said that, but that's it. But thank you, friend. I would say it's back to that balance of you have to have, you have to set the foundation that there's going to be a level of accountability to the forecast. And you have to dig in with the forecast when you are in a high and when you are in a low. So oftentimes you'll see the forecast inspection happens when you're having a down quarter. Forecast inspection needs to happen in the best of quarters, because if you just only pivot to when you're down, then it's in a fear-based moment and you're making decisions that are informed by that stress of missing. You've got to have that same level of rigor all the time. And you got to teach your leaders that. You've got to demonstrate that that's really important. You're going to have rigor when you're having the best quarter, and you're going to have rigor when you're having the worst quarter. And so you learn that and you teach that, and that becomes kind of your basis for accountability. And I think right now, especially in 2023, it's hard to anticipate. So it's back to having really healthy skepticism about every deal. They could be it could look beautiful, but let's just go in with a skeptical mindset and shoot holes in this, because we don't have the benefit of a buffer. We don't have a growing, a macroeconomic environment that's different. So I think that's really important. It's just acknowledge that and go in with some skepticism.
Now, I love this segment. It's a quick fire.
Okay.
I say a short statement. You give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Let's do it.
So what sales tactics have not changed over the last 5 years?
I would say, selling is an art and a science. And I think, but at its core, it's about really good listening and bringing value. So it's back to like people buy from people. And so it's really like good listening, connecting with that buyer and bringing value in response to their answer. So I don't think that's changed.
What sales tactics have died a death?
We talked about it a bit, but I think on-sites are dying a death. They're not gone, but I think we've learned how much we can do virtually. And so that old, like everything must be on-site, in-person handshaking has really changed. And it's crazy to see that we're not all on airplanes like we were just, a few years ago, but it's changed. So I think that's definitely, I don't know if it's died a death, but it's dying.
What is the biggest mistake founders make when hiring sales teams?
Setting expectations. I think it's really important to both have a common, like, here's where we think we can go. Here's where like really having a mutual understanding and joint belief in those expectations. But you got to set them, because if the founder believes here and the first sales leader thinks we can only get to here because those expectations weren't set, then you're just going to have a mismatch. You
call up a new sales leader the night before they start their role. What advice would you give them?
I would give them the advice of like really dig in and learn in those first, 90 days deeply, but be prepared to relearn everything in 90 days. So it's like, you got to go deep and understand and get in as many customer calls as you can and really work to understand the mechanics and the operating rhythm of the business. But then you will take that basis of foundation and you're going to learn it again, because you're going to have all that context and you're going to pivot your mindset and build off of that first 90 days. So I think it's like the expectation is just be ready to keep learning. That's not going to stop. You're not done after quarter one.
What would you most like to change about the world of sales?
This has changed tremendously in my career, but I would like to see more female leadership at the top. I think it's changed so much in my time in sales, but just more female leadership would be something I would change.
I mean, we have 20 Sales Fund, which is like 8 of the most incredible sales leaders. And it was funny how it came together. Like, it was not meant to be like an all-female group. And then you're like, oh, wow. I learned that actually women are just better than men at sales.
And to your point, it's changed a ton, which is great, but we just can't, we got to take our eye off the ball. That has to be still a priority. So I
totally agree. Yeah. Final one for you. Which company sales strategy have you most been impressed by recently? Where you look at it and you're like, smart.
Yeah, actually, we recently, it's recency, but we recently bought Vitally for our customer success team. So a customer success platform. And what I was really impressed with is really clear communication the whole way and very direct and engaging. But what I really have noticed is post-sale is how they continue to stay connected and care about the success of our launch. And especially in this time where gross retention, is so important, and thinking about retaining every customer that you spent so much time earning, they've stayed connected through that whole process. So really clear communication, great sales process up front, but they're continuing it through all the way as we've become a customer. So I've been very impressed by that.
That was a great answer. Some people give their own company, and I'm like, oh, for fuck's sake. But that was amazing. Listen, I've loved this. Thank you so much for putting up with my very wayward, but I think brilliant questions.
They were great.
No, seriously, I've loved this. You were a star.
Thank you. It was a great conversation. I appreciate the time.